I've been running so many Black Myth Wukong benchmarks, and my last couple of videos focus on extremely high-end and extremely low-end with the RTX 4090 and the GTX 1060, and I was testing a ton of stuff, but it was mostly focused on graphics presets. In this video, I'm introducing more of a mid-range graphics card. I focused on the RTX 3060 because it's the most popular graphics card according to Steam, so this is more representative of what a lot of people might have. And in this video, I'm focusing more on, okay, let's not just stick to the graphics presets, let's optimize individual graphics settings for the combination of best visuals and performance. You can see the results of my findings in today's video on the right-hand side of the screen versus the left-hand side of the screen, where on the left-hand side, you're seeing the game at its not even maximum graphics preset, but its maximum non-full RT mode graphics preset with the cinematic settings, where on an RTX 3060, we're only getting 23 FPS at 1080p native resolution. However, if I go to my optimized settings without even touching the resolution slider, which can be another very effective way of getting more performance, at native 1080p resolution, we're going all the way up to 54 frames per second, which is 2.35 times the performance. But if you look at the side-by-side here, yes, there is some downgrade to some of the visual settings here, but a lot of it still looks really good, and I wouldn't say that we have an absolutely massive cut. Now, depending on your graphics hardware, you might need to cut further, you might not need to cut this amount, but I think for a lot of people, this is gonna give you a game that's looking quite good and still quite performant. However, there's only so much we can do for performance in this game, because unfortunately, we do have stuttering from Unreal Engine 5. Now, here's my evidence for this, and I'll talk about what other people are seeing as well. Look at this frame rate graph. Do you guys see these little lines where it dips down? That would be experienced as a sudden drop in your frame rate, which would be seen as a visual stutter when you're playing the game. Now, look at this frame time graph. FPS graph. It's not a frame time graph. Anyway, the point is the dips are gone. So what's the difference here? This is playing the game on the exact same graphics card, running the built-in benchmark, so exactly the same scene, but this is the second time I ran it, and this is the first time I ran it. And you see this one has those frame time spikes, it's those stutters. Now, I've also seen this on, for example, on my GTX this is actually my RTX 3060 here, where I get this spike the first time I run the built-in benchmark, and the second time I run it, that spike is gone. So again, some indication of what's called shader compilation stutters, where the game does have a shader compilation step, which does mean it's trying to compile shaders so that you don't get those stutters the first time a shader loads. However, it doesn't seem to be catching all of them, because the first time you see certain shaders, you get that stutter. The second time through, it's gone, indicating that is shader compilation stutter. Now, also, I'm limited to the built-in benchmark for my findings. However, full reviews of the game are out, and I've been combing them for a couple of things. Number one, how's the performance overall? Does it have stuttering in the full game? But also, how representative is the built-in benchmark of the actual performance in the game? And the best reference to that I've found has actually been in the review of the game from WCCF Tech, where they discuss traversal stutters, but then they also mention that it, meaning the built-in benchmark, is a decent enough representation of the performance you should expect during most of the game, minus the traversal stutters. So we're seeing that, at least according to this review, the full version of the game is fairly similar in performance to the built-in benchmark. I imagine some scenes are better, some scenes are worse, but this is probably somewhat typical. However, again, they're mentioning traversal stutters. So traversal stutters are a bit different than shader compilation stutters. Traversal stutters mostly happen as you're moving through the game. You enter a new area that the game suddenly loads in a bunch of assets, and that puts a burden on the system momentarily and can cause a large stutter. This is especially troubling if it happens in combat, and there is some mention of that taking place. So, in other words, while we can talk about optimizing the graphic settings that we have control over, we don't have control over the stuttery mess that sometimes comes of Unreal Engine 5 games, and we are seeing reviews reporting this. Not only the WCCF Tech article, I've read a bunch of them. For example, here's PC Gamer talking about graphics shaders tanking performance so badly that instead of swapping your skill points, you're swapping video settings to find a combination that'll get you through the next section. And they actually even talk about dropping all the way down to medium settings on a 4090 to try to reduce the amount of stuttering that they were seeing. So anyway, so there's all of those caveats. However, if we jump back into the built-in benchmarks, let's talk a bit about optimizing the graphic settings in this game. So in order to reach optimized settings, I first looked at the overall built-in presets. So let's take a quick look at that. So this is the RTX 3060. I guess my face is still in the way. Let's be tiny and out of the way. At the maximum non-full RT mode settings, which is called cinematic, so not even the true maximum settings in the game, as we've seen, the RTX 3060 only hits 23 frames per second. This is all at native 1080p resolution, and actually, quick note on that for a second. Let's talk about how to get to native resolution in this game, because I've seen comments on my previous videos saying they didn't even know how to get to native resolution. So you have to choose a super resolution sampling method, either DLSS, XCSS, FSR, or TSR. But then you take the resolution slider and slide it to 100%. And then you are at your monitor's native rendering resolution. And it's just using this super resolution technology as an anti-aliasing method from native resolution. For my testing on an RTX GPU, I chose to use the DLSS pathway because I think that that is optimal from a visual standpoint. But if you're not on an RTX NVIDIA GPU, if you're either on a GTX NVIDIA GPU, you would have to fall back to something like TSR or FSR or XCSS, or if you're on an AMD graphics card or Intel graphics card, again, those would be your choices. I'll give some more thoughts on that a bit later in the video. So that's what I mean by native 1080p DLAA, is I'm using the DLSS pathway slid to 100%. So resolution left at native 1080p, what we can see here is that the going from cinematic settings to very high settings only gains me 17% performance and boosts frame rate from 23 to 27. Going to high settings bumps performance up to 46 FPS, which is actually doubling the frame rate we got on cinematic. The medium settings go up to 61 FPS, which is pretty good right there. So honestly, you could just pick the medium settings and call it good on an RTX 3060. It's 2.65 times the performance of the cinematic mode. And then our low settings are actually going all the way up to 80 FPS, and it's almost 3.5 times the performance. But even in this little sliver of the scene that you can see here, which honestly isn't giving you a great representation of what these modes look like and their differences because it's such a small slice, you can still see that the low settings look significantly worse than everything else. So that's some indication that there is a lot of scalability in this game, even without using rendering resolution sliders, but that you might not want to go too far with it. Also, for those of you sharp-eyed viewers out of there who already watched my RTX 4090 video, you might notice that these relative performance scaling numbers for the 3060 are actually very different than what I saw in my RTX 4090. On my RTX 4090, I tested at 4K native resolution, again using the DLSS pathway for full resolution. And again, this is 4K native, which is challenging for a 4090 in this game at cinematic settings, hitting 47 FPS. We notice very high scales, 11% to 52. High settings bumping frame rate up to 67 FPS, which is 43% better than cinematic. Medium settings hitting 85 FPS, which is 81% better than cinematic. And low settings jumping to 104 FPS, which is over double the performance, 2.21 times the performance of the cinematic settings. Now, with all of that being said, while these exact numbers are different, when we do go back and compare it to my RTX 3060 results, notice that there's one thing in common. The low settings look dramatically worse than everything else, and the medium settings give a big bump over high, and high gives a big bump over cinematic, but very high settings don't give a very big bump over cinematic. So this led my quest for optimized settings to start kind of in the medium graphics preset area, because again, on both the 3060 and even when we jump into the 4090, you'll notice that while the exact percentage scaling is different, the medium settings seem to perhaps be a somewhat optimal place to be, but not completely optimal. I do also want to notice something about VRAM in this game. So when we get to the end of this run where we can see the VRAM results reported here, let's pop back here really quick. A note on VRAM in this game is that actually, even at 4K native, no upscaling used at all, even at cinematic settings, we're only seeing 8.3 gigabytes of VRAM used. So this game is extremely efficient on VRAM usage. And actually, if we pop back into the RTX 3060, the RTX 3060 also, this one's looking at 1080p resolution. The maximum native 1080p settings without ray tracing only hit 5.3 gigabytes of VRAM usage. So if you have a GPU with at least 6 gigabytes of VRAM, you will not run into VRAM issues. And it looks like we can scale down to about 4 gigabytes of VRAM, but you'd start having VRAM-related issues even at the lowest settings in the game if you didn't have at least 4 gigabytes of VRAM. But the nice thing here is this means that 8 gigabyte graphics cards actually shouldn't have an issue with this game, which is really, really good to see. But anyway, I should mention again, though, that I haven't talked about ray tracing yet. So this is one of NVIDIA's big ray tracing showcase type games, but this is an optimized settings video, so I'm just going to mention that there is a very demanding ray tracing setting available in this game. If you look at even an RTX 4090 trying to play 1440p native with the full RT very high settings, you're only down at 45 FPS. Compared to the game's cinematic settings where it hits 74. So that is pretty demanding. Although we did see interesting things in my RTX 4090 video where when using upscaling, the performance gap between these shrunk to 26%. And performance went significantly up, indicating that ray tracing is actually scaling better off of the rendering resolution slider coming down than the non-ray traced full RT mode settings do, and kind of closing a bit of that gap. So if you're going to be using a lot of resolution scaling, you might consider the RT effects, but only if you have an extremely powerful GPU. Because again, here's an RTX 4090 using DLSS quality at 1440p and hitting only 73 FPS, which is perfectly playable, but it's an RTX 4090. Now, I will mention that you don't have to max out the ray tracing settings. There's medium RT and RT low. And here, if you're trying to optimize this a bit, notice the RT low settings, the reflections look noticeably worse compared to medium and very high RT settings, but the performance between medium and RT low is much, much lower. I mean very, very similar. Like we're only gaining 2 frames per second here when I'm comparing those. Whereas comparing the very high settings to the medium, you're actually gaining 29% performance on the 4090 here at native 1440p. So that's a pretty big performance gain going to RT medium over RT very high. So if you are trying to use ray tracing, but you just can't handle the very high settings, do consider the perhaps the medium settings being a better way to go, although they are definitely noticeably downgraded compared to very high, just not as much as compared to the low settings. But another thing I do want to bring up regarding the full RT mode is, okay, here's the full RT mode again versus the cinematic mode, which isn't the full RT mode. And sure, like if you notice the reflection of the torch that we just saw there, it was visible in the water on the full RT mode. It wasn't in cinematic mode. I think the shadows also look significantly better with the full RT mode. It's, in my opinion, not just like a complete night and day difference when you look at something like a game like Cyberpunk, where the full path tracing mode is completely outclassing any other visual mode available in the game. Honestly, Unreal Engine 5's Lumen is so good that while full RT effects can do some things better than the cinematic mode, it's not absolutely crushing it in my opinion. And watch the grass in the full RT mode right here. It kind of flickers in a way that it didn't on the cinematic mode. And that gets worse as you turn down to the medium and low settings for full RT. So I will say, I think for optimized settings, which is what this video is about, if you want to use ray tracing, consider the medium settings and definitely consider rendering resolution scaling. But for less powerful hardware, I would just leave the full RT mode off. Also, I'll mention even lower-end GPUs can play this game, like here's a GTX 1060, but even on a GTX 1060, I would avoid pushing everything down to low, because you can see that the medium settings and the low settings look low settings look significantly worse. And even a card as old as a GTX 1060 can actually reach decent frame rates without going all the way down to low, although you are having to play around with the render resolution slider, and it's going to look a bit pixelated at 1080p. But anyway, let's get into, okay, so what actually were my optimized settings? So here's what the optimized settings look like, at least that I chose for the 3060 here. And I think the game looks pretty good and the frame rate is fine, especially if you're on a variable refresh rate display. We're averaging 54 FPS here. It's gonna feel pretty good. If you're on weaker hardware or need to hit 60 FPS because you don't have variable refresh rate, you could tweak some things a little bit further. But I think for a lot of hardware, this represents pretty playable experience in a single player game without sacrificing a whole lot of visual quality. But what graphic settings am I actually using to get here? So let's take a look at that. So here's what the graphics settings menu looks like on this. And what you'll notice is it's a mixture of medium settings and cinematic settings, which might seem a little bit weird, like why not high? Well, when I actually did this, again, based on what I've showed you, I saw the medium settings felt like a performance and visual quality kind of optimized preset, but then I wanted to tweak the individual graphic settings. And so what I did is I started at the medium settings and I went through each setting and I adjusted it to see what kind of performance impact it had. And what I noticed is certain graphic settings had very large performance impacts, and certain graphic settings had almost no performance impact, which was really interesting. So the settings that, at least on my testing through the built-in benchmark, had a small or no performance impact, I left those up at cinematic. So here we're at cinematic on view distance quality, anti-aliasing quality. One notice on that, I'm wondering if the anti-aliasing quality setting might only apply to Unreal Engine 5's TSR maybe. So maybe if you're using the TSR pathway, you might want to pay more attention to the anti-aliasing quality and just see if my hunch is correct that maybe it would have more of an effect. But anyway, so anti-aliasing quality, I left at cinematic. Post-effects quality, I left at cinematic, but shadow quality had a much larger impact to performance, so I kept that one at medium. Texture quality had an impact on VRAM and a small impact on performance, but not huge. So I pushed it all the way back up to cinematic because I did find it visually noticeable. And again, the VRAM usage in this game is quite low. So unless you're on a card with below 5 gigabytes of VRAM, you might be able to keep the maximum texture settings in this game. The visual effect quality, again, had a measurable performance impact if I pushed past medium, so I kept it there. Hair quality wasn't that massive, but I kept it at medium. It did have a noticeable effect. Same thing with vegetation quality. And global illumination quality was the other one that had a huge effect. And I'll also mention that pushing it all the way down to low will also give you another large performance boost, but I also found that to be a lot more visually noticeable. So I left global illumination quality at medium without going down to low, but if you need more performance, you could try pushing down global illumination quality to low. And then reflection quality, I expected this to have a large performance impact, but believe it or not, it didn't. So I put, and I mean, there's water reflections in this built-in benchmark all over the place. So anyway, I pushed this all the way up to cinematic. And so that's the settings that I was using when you saw the test that we were running right here. So overall, like I said, I think it looks pretty good. And the performance is perfectly playable on mid-range hardware, and that's before I have touched render resolution scaling, which is another place we could get a bunch of performance. Now, when I want to show you what we're seeing here, ooh, I have the wrong name right here. Okay, this one should not say cinematic. This should say medium. Okay, right here. This should be medium. So on the left, what you're actually looking at here is medium. Don't look at that saying cinematic. So what I'm trying to show you here is I use the medium settings as the baseline. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at my optimized settings. And you can see that the optimized settings reach 89% of the performance of the medium graphics preset. Okay, so we're reaching 89%, we're within 11% of the performance of the medium preset. Now, my optimized settings list is worse performance than the medium preset, but I think if you look at the details here, you'll see that my optimized settings look better than the medium preset because of all those settings that I've slid all the way back up to maximum. So I think that we have performance that is similar to the medium preset while visually taking advantage of things that we could turn back up, especially things like textures, without losing a huge amount of detail. Now, all of it's a bit subtle, but I think if you look at the details here, and if you're on a phone, you can pinch and zoom. I think things, especially like the texture settings and things like that, do look noticeably better here, and we're only losing 11% of performance by sliding about half of the settings back up to cinematic instead of being at medium. So that's where we're at here. And again, I want to jump to, okay, but what about render resolution scaling? So if you go up to 1440p resolution, then the problem becomes, well, it's possible that those optimized settings I give you just aren't gonna be enough of a performance gain. So I would suggest, rather than going down to low settings, where I've shown you there's a big visual hit, if you're at 1440p resolution, you might want to play with the rendering resolution slider. So that's what we're looking at here, is on the left-hand side of the screen, we're seeing the RTX 3060 playing at native 1440p DLAA with my optimized preset, but now we're only hitting 37 FPS because we're playing at 1440p on an RTX 3060 in a pretty demanding game. On the right-hand side of the screen, though, we're looking at 66% render resolution scaling, which when you're using DLSS, that's basically the DLSS quality preset. And honestly, it looks pretty good. It's definitely not full native rendering resolution, but it's not a massive visual hit. But we're gaining back 51% of the performance, which is really nice. So I think that that's a reasonable trade-off to make for the, a bit of a softer image, especially in motion, but not terribly so, and gaining 51% performance. And now we're perfectly playable with good-looking graphic settings on an RTX 3060 in this game, which at 1440p monitor, which is pretty cool. Now, the other thing I'll mention, though, is what if you want to use frame generation? Well, now we run into a bit of a problem. So let me pause this here for a second and explain why I'm suddenly switching to TSR and FSR when I'm on an RTX 3060, which you might be like, shouldn't you be using DLSS? Well, that's where we need to unfortunately talk about the fact that this game is not using FSR 3.1. FSR 3.1 would allow frame generation to be toggled on any upscaler, like DLSS or FSR or XESS or any of them. However, in this game, I can toggle the frame generation button when I'm on TSR, and I can toggle it when I'm on FSR. However, if I go to XESS, I can't use frame generation. And on DLSS, I get the warning that my card doesn't support that mode. In other words, even though this game's frame generation button isn't making it necessarily clear, it looks like when you're using FSR, you can use FSR frame generation on a 30 series NVIDIA GPU. And you can use it when you're using FSR, and it seemed to even allow it when using TSR, which was interesting, but it didn't allow it for XES or DLSS. So if this had been FSR 3.1, which is available now, and it would be cool if it got updated to that at some point, you should be able to use frame generation from FSR even when you're using upscaling from DLSS. And if you're on a 40 series graphics card from NVIDIA, you could use the DLSS frame generation. But a lot of people aren't, like if you're on an RTX 3060. In which case, if you want to use frame generation, but you're not on a 40 series NVIDIA GPU, that's why I had to go with a choice of either using TSR or FSR if I want to turn frame generation on. Now, quick side note about frame generation as I kind of play this and we look at the results. So frame generation, it's important to understand what it does and what it doesn't do. Frame generation does increase the frame rate. You see more frames, which does increase the motion fluidity of the game visually. What it doesn't do is increase the responsiveness of the game. Normally, people associate two things with your frame rate increasing. If you get a higher frame rate, you generally get more motion fluidity because you see more frames on the screen, and you generally get more responsiveness to the game because the game engine is rendering more frames so it can respond to you quicker. Frame generation does not increase the responsiveness of the game because the game engine is not actually rendering more frames. The frame generation is just visually inserting frames between frames that the game engine has actually rendered. So you will get more motion fluidity at a bit of a latency penalty rather than a latency benefit. So do keep that in mind. Now visually here, we can see that actually, while I'd usually prefer TSR over FSR here, they're fairly close, and I'd really like to see a combat scene with a lot of movement and particle effects, because that's where FSR can kind of fall apart. But in the built-in benchmark here, I'd say the visuals are fairly close, and I will say that then performance-wise, I'm actually getting 12% better performance out of the FSR pathway than the TSR pathway, at least with the settings I've enabled here. So I would say that maybe I'd push towards using the FSR pathway if you want to use frame generation on a non-40 series GPU. However, I'm like I said, I'd want to see more of the actual combat in the game and see how the character model holds up in motion before I'm too comfortable making a hard call on FSR being the better choice here. So anyway, that's the tests that I've ran for you in this video. Basically, to kind of summarize what we're looking at is that compared to just clicking max settings, my optimized settings get you 2.35 times the performance, at least on an RTX 3060. It's probably going to be a little bit different on different graphics cards. As we showed, performance scaling was different on the RTX 4090. What were my optimized settings? The optimized settings were basically this, where I noticed that medium was gaining a lot of performance on certain settings, but other settings had very little performance impact, so I ended up here. If you end up having a weaker graphics card than the one I saw here, you'd have a couple of options. You can push things like global illumination all the way down to low. You could push things like the stuff I left at cinematic. You could play around with it, but it might not gain you a lot of performance, but it's at least some. And then also you can go a lot harder on the render resolution slider. Because the render resolution slider gains you a lot of performance, but you can start making the game look pretty soft, especially if you're at 1080 on a 1080p display. Now, the higher resolution your display is, the harder I think you should push the render resolution slider. So if you're on a 4K display, pushing all the way down to around 50% for DLSS can actually still look okay. Whereas if you're on a 1080p display, going all the way down to 50% or lower can look pretty bad. So anyway, also if you're unable to access DLSS, the FSR, I wouldn't push quite as hard on the super resolution slider, just because it struggles a bit more at those lower internal rendering resolutions. I also mentioned that, you can try out frame generation and things like that, but again, that's not gaining you more responsiveness if that's what you're looking for, but it does get you more motion fluidity. Hopefully you found this video useful and or interesting. A huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, commenters, channel members who click the join button down below to directly support the channel financially. And consider clicking that button if you want to support all the benchmarking and news and whatnot I do on the channel. Huge thank you to everybody who has. You get, in return, like early access to some videos. It's easier for me to see your comments because the little member badges on them and things like that. So cool stuff there as a thank you, and I hope everybody has an excellent day.